an undeniable climate emergency podcast.
Today we have a wonderful discussion with Henri-Count Evans, PhD, lecturer at the University of Eswantini. Henry is an emerging scholar in journalism, climate change, and environmental humanities and media studies. We discuss the transition away from fossil fuels in Africa and what the role the North has and what their responsibilities are to Africa, along with theoretical approaches to climate change, communication, and sustainability. Enjoy this episode.
Henry, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. What I usually like to start out is just give you a chance to talk about some of your background, how you ended up in your area of expertise, in your case around communication and climate and the other areas, just a general chance to introduce yourself and let us know how you kind of ended up in your area of work.
Thank you so much, Harold, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's been there for some months. And maybe as a way of background, I'm Zimbabwean, and I think I got introduced to climate change in general around 2009 when I was doing an online course that was sponsored by the UN but hosted by a Zimbabwean NGO. I think it was around climate change mainstreaming. So in the middle of the course, what I found interesting was that everything was seen to be so straightforward. The science was there, action was lacking. And because I come from communication, I thought, but wait a moment, what is being done from the side of journalism and more generally from the side of the NGOs that are championing this particular important cause? And if ever there is anything, what kind of frames do we find prominent and given more salience? So I think around that time, I started thinking about my fourth year bachelor's dissertation. And lucky enough, around the same time, there was a call for abstracts from MIT. There was UNESCO chair of communication, Professor Ian Service. Now I think he's in Hong Kong. So I was making a call for a conference that was going to look at green communication. And I thought there was an opportunity for me to talk about climate change communication in Africa in general. So I had a paper there and then led to a book chapter, which is now published. And also I focused on factors that were sort of impeding climate communication in Zimbabwe then as part of my dissertation. But then it moved on to the master's. When I went to South Africa to the University of KwaZulu-Natal for my master's, then I started looking more critical. I think now I was better informed at how the global media treated climate change issues, especially those that were issues around the global south. And for me, most importantly, how issues of African climate change were being covered in the global north media. And by that, maybe I should be more specific. I looked at the Washington Post, New York Times, then the Guardian and the Telegraph. So 2 UK, 2 American papers, and sort of trying to understand how they were constructing the very narratives of this climate emergence that we're facing, and trying to understand the geopolitics that was involved in that, and whether there was a continuity in terms of north-south kind of ideological or neo-colonial narrative production. But I think this was still part of my learning, trying to dive into this space and getting to understand things better. But I think when I went for PhD, my supervisor said, hold on, you already know what's happening from the north, but no one is talking about the global south. How is the media in the south talking about climate change issues in the south? And how do they construct these issues in relation to global hierarchies and the orders that we find at the UN, the multilateral system? So my PhD was refocused, and I ended up studying how the mainstream newspapers in South Africa constructed and framed climate change discourses. I mean, very interesting discoveries in there. And I think from that particular time, I had an interest in understanding how, as the Global South, we were involved in this discourse and whether there was sincerity on the part of us. Yes, there was the question of we are not historically responsible for the climate problem. So we should be allowed a developmental space to sort of allow us to use coal, use fossils, and more or less to do nothing. I would rather be blunt. The clamors for let's just do nothing about it. After all, America and Europe must fund us if they want us to transition. And that for me was number one. Yes, historical Africa is not responsible. Even presently, I think we contribute in very limited ways, but we are contributors. What was more key at the second level is while the historical part is correct, and we can refer to the Rio Earth Summit and talk about common but differentiated responsibilities and later on capabilities, what are we doing about the coal that we're digging now and that we're using now to fire our development? I'm deliberately using the word fire because I think our problems are around that particular word. Are we going to turn back in 2100 and say, or is Asia going to turn back and say, yeah, it's Africa that was emitting around the 2020s. It's not us, so we're not responsible. Do we want to be in that kind of cycle? But that was not the most important. From my studies, I think what I found is that these discourses have particular sponsors, and these sponsors are neoliberal, and their interests are profit. So it's not essentially about the location. I like to talk about the global north and the global south, but in very different ways. I believe this, of course, is debatable, but I believe we do have the global north within the south, and that north is doing a lot in terms of emissions. And we also have the south within the north that is doing exactly the opposite. I mean, they are not responsible for anything. They actually are victims also. So that forces me to think of responsibility regardless of location, but without forgetting previous inequalities. Maybe that's my background in a way.
Well, I mean, all of that's really critical framing that going back to where you started from has been largely absent from global north coverage, and I think probably too much from the global south, just from the climate conversation in general. I think it's just starting to emerge outside of the more explicitly left conversation around questions of colonization and the ongoing impacts, because it's changed but hasn't ended. So I think this is incredibly important area of work here. And I mean, let's start on that question, because I think it's, as you describe it being, who are the interests that are talking about the need to burn fossil fuels for development in the global south, and it's really the neoliberal, and that's also used in the global north as an excuse to continue producing and not changing course. And I would say that, as I think you were saying, many of the people saying that, it's really quite disingenuous. It's not the people actually worried about raising living standards and development, right? The people who are making the argument that we need to keep burning fossil fuels to allow development in previously colonized countries in the global south are really, generally, if you look back at the people, I find are usually the people who want to continue colonial exploitation of those areas, right? And they want to keep selling fossil fuels. But there's a very real question there, which is the global north built industrialization in part on the massive burning of fossil fuels, in even larger part on the theft and pillaging of entire continents and civilizations, right? So it was this combination. But the ability to have all that energy was part of it. So how do we look at the question of development in a way that's not giving license to the fossil fuel companies just to keep doing what they're doing and use development and raising living standards as an excuse, but actually gets to the heart of it, right? How do we look at this real question of what does development require? I mean, where are you seeing in terms of where the conversation is, where the potential is there? I mean, I think that to me, it does require investment from the global north, right? The Western Europe, the United States has benefited historically and ongoing and continues to from theft of resources from Africa, from South America, from Asia, has caused most of the global emissions that are causing climate change. But how is it that we can get a transition that both addresses the climate emergency, which is already a catastrophe and is going to get worse, and looks at raising living standards? Have you found a framework that's helpful for kind of finding finding that model of development?
Thank you. Those are very interesting, complicated questions. Maybe I'll just.
Yes, sorry. I was trying to start something simpler, and then I realized I got very complicated. It's tough, right? But that question of development. So let's look at what does development mean within the context of the climate emergency and just development that really actually looks to raise people's living standards for real and not just line up multinational corporation pockets even more. Right? So anyways, now I'll let you talk. Sorry. Maybe it's slightly simpler framing.
You are raising very interesting points, and I think I'll talk last about your last term that I think I like, just development. Of course, I have ideas about the use of the word itself, but maybe in trying to answer your question, I want to sort of talk about the interests, the coal interest. In South Africa, we talk about them, but I believe even in countries like Zimbabwe that language is very much serious now. The sort of minerals energy complex. So if you have businesses, coal mines, then you have companies that are in the business of distribution. Then you have companies that are into mining, even if it's not coal, but that benefit from subsidies and lower electricity rates. So obviously, when they think about a future without coal, they see an increase in the cost of production because now they have to use more money to buy electricity, which by any comparison, huge companies in South Africa pay less per kilowatt than households, which is an injustice anyway. They make money, they take the money to Australia, they take the money to the United States, they take the money to the United Kingdom, but they pay less for the electricity. So who are these sponsors? So you find that the sponsors are essentially corporate interest. And these corporate interests have some kind of an audience with ministries of energy, which sort of regulates their operations. But over and above that, you find that ruling elites and ruling political parties within the region are so much vested and invested at the same time in energy generation. So you find that ruling political parties, through their investment vehicles, have shares in coal mines that then send that coal to the electricity distributors. So it's a very complex scenario. Once you cut off coal, you've cut off their existence. So the political economy of coal becomes, I think, big and bigger. But maybe coming to your question of what is development there, I would say number one, obviously development is the opposite of a few benefiting at the expense of the rest. So the few elites, political and economic elites, having access to resources and access to energy at the expense of the majority. That's the opposite of development. Then what is development then? I think over the years, I've been trying to navigate that particular terrain. I think at some point, I had given up using the word development, precisely because I was seeing that it has a lot of these ideological connotations. Once you were talking of development, you were then thought to be also talking about modernization as an economic model. So for some time, I'd stopped using it. But I think slowly I'm coming back to say the word itself is not a problem, but the problem is the definitions that we then attach to it. And I would say that the word development itself, for me, at some point was problematic because of what it carries or because of what it has been assigned. That it means neoliberal kind of development, which is along the lines of modernization. But I think for a year or two now, I've brought it back into my theorizing, and I started talking about the idea that is not very new, but the idea that has been there for quite some time. And this idea is inspired, I think, by my theoretical sort of inspiration, where I try and look at the Marxist and neo-Marxist idea of metabolism and whether it is possible to regain the metabolic relations that ideally once existed between people and their environment. That's a very ambitious objective that is well sounding theoretically, but that needs some kind of rethinking and seeing how that can be implemented. For me, the entry points are very simple. Moving away from the very contested definitions and whether we want to start thinking of de-development, we want to think of de-urbanization and all of that. But I want to think of development as number one, human progress, that number one, people have access to basic services, and that is education, that is clean water, hygienic living conditions, access to normal roads or communication travel infrastructure, built around the idea that what we need is to think of the use of whatever we are doing before we think of its exchange value. So it's still within that Marxist kind of inspiration, but that needs modification. So practical explaining what I'm talking about. If you come to Southern Africa, 70% of our people live in villages. So they live in rural areas. And my thinking is there a need for us to bring these people into town where they are going to need to get mortgages from banks to buy land and build homes and pay a lot of money for water, for electricity? Or do we need to build a good communication network that connects them from wherever they are so that they have access to whatever they need, but without the need for them to get a loan from a bank to build a home, because where they are is already good enough? So we keep people staying where they are. What we've done is that we've eliminated the bank and the capital interest. We have built networks that are good enough to allow them to travel, be that they want to buy tomatoes, but generally there is no need for them to think about, I'll need a house, because already they have the land and they have a home. So we begin to talk about the need for satisfaction within particular dimensions. So your children can go to a local school properly without walking long distances. If you go to a local clinic, there is medication, you can see a doctor, you can see a nurse, but you don't have to travel long distances for that. You can, for example, if you decide to work 60 kilometers away, you can use rail if it's available, but that is powered by renewable energy, for example. What that does, you should be able to go to work from your home if you have to work. But what we have done in that process, we've eliminated the building of tall buildings that use so much iron, that use so much cement, and we've eliminated the need for massive electricity to power these buildings. We keep people where they are. And it's not so much ideal for societies that have gone past that stage. But it's a model that can be pursued in countries where there is still land and sort of land distribution systems that accommodate this. And that's why I want to be very specific to the Southern African region, because there is a communal land system that is still very functional. And there is some kind of security. For example, where I come from, my great-grandfather had that land, my grandfather had that land, my father had that land. Okay, unfortunately, because of urbanization elsewhere, that land is lying idle because we had to move to cities because we couldn't work from our homes. So there is that problem. But development that is based on satisfying basic human needs and making sure that we use very limited resources to achieve that, and based on the idea that we pursue use over profit. Because once we pursue profit, we begin to have, for example, farming that is massively commercialized. But the question is, can we do away with commercial farming if we want to achieve food security and things like that? A very interesting question, but I think also context specific. I live in Eswatini, for example. I buy my food from the shops because I don't have a piece of land where I farm. But I can tell you that I think 40 to 42% of the people grow their own staple food. But they need support at 2 or 3 levels. The first support is to tell them that let's have a discussion around that this is actually okay, that you should live where you are and grow your own food with less chemicals, for example. So you find that they use your your compost, your cow manure and stuff like that to grow their maize, to grow their vegetables. But there is need to go beyond the idea that that is ancient, because if you go to people that live that life, they don't like it. They aspire to live in towns in high-rise buildings. And essentially that is because of how we have defined development. That is defined by tall buildings, wide roads, traffic lights, monster cars, for example. People living in 8-bedroomed houses, but they're just 4 or 5. That is the vision and the vision that people have. So I always joke with my class to say, let us just list the things that we aspire to have once we graduate and we start working. So they mention Toyota double cabs. You find that they mention, I want to build a beautiful home with so many bedrooms, with a swimming pool, with a wall fence, and exclude everyone else from seeing my house, of course, and from partaking in whatever I'm doing. But Is that really what we call development? How exclusive is that kind of lifestyle? Is it possible to rethink what we call development? Pursue kind of lifestyles that say that having less is okay. So instead of pursuing good life, we can think of pursuing living well. Living well simply meaning that we have all the things that we need to live a decent life, but good life being the opposite. We have too many things that we don't need, leading to some kind of consumerism that can't be controlled, for example. Some kind of hedonistic consumption that you can't justify, but that you have to really use your logic to try and justify why you've built a monster home and you drive a V-Cross car when you could do well with a 1.4 engine. So I think it is possible to get there, but I'm not sure if society is ready to unlearn what they've internalized as development, and whether we need a new communication approach that is communal, but that begins to charter a way of saying, how else can we live better with what we have and with our environment? Removing the idea that as humans we have massive power over the environment, we can essentially do what we want with it. But being able to know that whatever we have around us is infinite, it gets exhausted. And the more we use it, the more we're increasing the complexity risks that will arise. I think that would be my own idea of development, but within a very confined context where it is still possible.
That's really a powerful framework. When asked if you had a framework, I'm a bit blown away because that's such powerful, fundamental rethinking. And it obviously there's, it ties in with ideas of degrowth economics and a lot of the other ideas that are coming around. But I think that there's a clarity to what you've laid out. And one big, quick point I want to make that I think is so important about what you said, which is specificity. That when we look at, we know that the way things are going is already collapsing, right? So that's no longer a question. Colonial capitalism as we know it, it's a question of how many decades, or is there an S at the end of the decade, right? It's already in a system of collapse. We don't know what comes, whether we can steer it to something that's sustainable in any way or not. But what I think is so critical about what you laid out, I want to talk about the general first and then go into some of the specifics, is that whatever the solutions are, they are not going to be the same every place. And they are going to have to grow out of local circumstances that are both cultural, ecological, technical, economic, all of the different pieces that come together. So what you laid out as a possible means of kind of a elevating, in some sense, subsistence agricultural lifestyle, right? Bringing some of, that's what I kind of hear, is that it's that it doesn't have to be hardscrabble, but we have the technology to mean that we can raise the level of communication and give people access to education and different kinds of experiences and work, while still producing food in a way that doesn't actually take away from the future, right? Because that's what industrial agriculture does. Produces a huge amount by stealing future productivity, right? We steal wealth from the soil of the future in order to create profits now and lots of food now. We steal energy from the future and create overheating now. We steal life from the future. Everything we steal from the future So what you're talking to is a model really of how do we figure out one that actually replenishes for the future, that we're not just extracting for now. And most of those profits that get extracted aren't towards feeding people, right? They're towards concentrating wealth. But that's going to be different everywhere. And I think that's so important that's it's in New York State where I live, it's going to be different than in rural Southern Africa, right? However, New York State has a lot of rural areas as well where some of that model that you talk about actually could really apply, where people want to go back into farming. So there are also things to learn. So sometimes the specificity is between rural New York State and New York City, right? And then there's people who want to farm in the city, so there's things to learn. So there's kind of this interesting thing, which is we need to root these solutions where they are, and then there's also so much to learn between. So that's kind of the general, and I think it's really powerful what you laid out because it is rooted in real circumstances. But this model that you kind of lay out, which is, our sense of development of what's needed, which is increased industrialization, massive extraction of raw materials, increase in manufacturing, concentration of people of cities. It was really to allow for the Industrial Revolution, right? That's where that model development comes from. And if you're trying to exploit more of the world, you need more labor pools concentrated in cities, sent to enough schooling that they can work in a factory or a mine and good, all of those things. And what you're really laying out is, let's just throw out all of those presumptions. That model broke. It's already broken, right? Let's throw out those models and say, what models can we come up with that actually serve to make people's life livable, even, right? Sustainable and joyful. And I love the idea that how we can take, it's also this the Marx's idea of combining uneven development, right? That, and we see that in the classic case in Africa is around telephones. We overland landlines and went to cell phones. There's also that potential with energy production, but also communication production. That you can be rural and be getting a PhD from London. You can be, there's no reason anymore, right? So it's not about enforcing some group of people in ignorance and isolation. It's saying how you can live in a rural circumstance and get a PhD from a global city. Like, those aren't contradictory anymore. There's no reason not to, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's it. And we can use what we know and generalize from the technology and the energy production to make that life less stressful, right? That it doesn't have to be hard scrabble substance. Like, we know how to produce in a sustaining way more food, mainly by often paying attention to how we used to do it, right? I think this is just a fascinating framework of saying, let's just trash the idea of development. Then that doesn't mean there's no more cities, and people may still move into cities, and there are places where that's right, but there's other places where. And I think one great example of that in Ecuador. I don't know if you've been following the recent referendum, where there's multiple groups of indigenous peoples that pushed to stop oil extraction on national park land, which is also their home, right? It's also indigenous people's land.
Yeah.
And they don't want that's what they succeeded, right? They don't want that model. They don't want to have their home clear cut, mines, cattle farming, lumbering, and then they get shoved into being the worst treated workers in a new labor force. And they won, right? It was a victory, and it was incredibly hopeful to me. So I don't know. I'm kind of reflecting back everything you said because it's really fascinating. But I think that, so how do we, I think some of what it is, how do we even get, because first of all, we know the forces that we have to face off to allow things like this to happen, because the global corporate powers and the military and banking and IMF and everyone behind them obviously stands in opposition. But it feels like the first thing is, how do we get people to even imagine that this is possible, that it's good, that it may actually elevate their life? So, as you said, what is it that actually we are striving for in that? And maybe that kind of comes around to when we, to where you've been working now in communications. Like, how do we get those stories out? How do we get people to even imagine the possible? Because how do you get people to fight for something before they even think of it as possible, right? So how do we tell those stories? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? And have you been trying to do that work in the communications work you're doing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think just to reflect on what you've talked about, I think I followed recently the protest in Chile. Yeah, it should be Chile, around data centers, and communities were saying we don't want data centers around us. I remember joking at some point to say, what does this mean for the future of the internet and AI, for example? But maybe the central question is, how do the people in these communities view their future vis-a-vis the future of AI? What is it that is more important? Is it having more algorithms, or is it having the life? Because we can have algorithms, and by 2100 there's no one to use them. So that for me it was interesting, and I think it links to your initial point around temporality, how geologically we have stolen from the future already, and we cannot even restore what we've stolen from the future. Then coming back to the question around, so how do you get the information out? I think over the past 10, 13 years, there is something that I think I've noticed. I think over my research, we have had a lot of NGOs that are quote unquote champion the cause, the environmental cause. But over whatever they are doing, I have a feeling that the messaging has not been, number one, consistent. And number two, the message has fallen into a very dangerous neoliberal trap, where we've sort of essentialized particular forms of transition, but without rethinking the political economy for existence. And that is dangerous on the basis that you might move from coal, but maybe what we need to think about is coal itself is a tool that is part of the toolbox of a capitalist machinery. So leaving it underground doesn't necessarily mean that you've dislodged and you've disrupted the very way of life that needs it. I talk of capitalism in a very strange and uncomfortable way, that we shouldn't underestimate it, number one. I think we've seen the profess of Marx of moribund capitalism, that it's not correct. And the reason why it's not correct, I think people have looked to ideology and stuff like that, but we shouldn't take away from capitalism its potential to self-mutate.
Yeah.
It has a snake behavior. And we should understand that it's not outside factors that propel it, but internally its contradictions can result in its renewal. And we need to be thinking about those very critical. So the messaging that the NGOs have been pushing out, have not been dislodging the very foundations of the system, I think, that has led us to where we are today. And I think, yes, we have relied on science, that the science is unequivocal, that we have a climate crisis. We have climate change that has led to a climate crisis. Fair and fine, that is correct. I believe in that science. But I think we have not pushed enough to say, yes, the science has told us that. But what is behind what science is observing? And how do we deal with that? And we have partly lost that battle. And I'll explain why. If you look at the SDGs, well accepted, everyone talks about them. I think this year alone, all the workshops that I've gone to, SDGs are praised. They are nice to read. I like talking about equality, access to education, and all that. But when you look at their financing mechanism, the Addis Ababa mechanism, it's inherently neoliberal. But it's the same SDGs that we find being promoted across, and the language is always that let's have access to education, but how do we get it? Is something that we're not talking about. When we talk about clean environment, hygiene, and all that, how do we get there? Who is getting us there? And through what kind of mechanisms? And I think the moment we go, because at some point we had to do a paper that looked beyond the SDGs 17 goals, but look at how are they going to be funded. And if you want to look for why nothing is happening, you go back to that model that the funding hasn't been there. And the funding envisaged in the Addis Ababa protocol was very much neoliberal. But we have had our civil society champion. Not all of them, of course. I think we had a lot of debate around 2014, 2015, but they've been accepted because they are sustainable. Same applies to the Paris Agreement that's been celebrated, which I think, yes, it was what was possible multilaterally at that point, but the goal was never to save the planet, especially when you attend these negotiations. And I think I have done that in 2021. And I told myself, up until we rethink this and we make it about the planet and not about geopolitics, we are not going anywhere. We'll meet every year and we produce exactly the same result, which is nothing. If you look at Article 6, 6.2 to 6.4, and then maybe go to 6.8, they're essentially neoliberal ideas. But what is happening in terms of messaging is that the Paris Agreement has been seen as a success, and whatever is done around it is championed. So you find government ministers, they go to COPs, they get a lot of coverage, they talk positively about the Paris Agreement, and then just say, oh, by the way, we also need funding. We need that the pledges be remitted, and we also want a loss and damage fund and things like that. But they are not challenging the very existence of a problem that is political economic. And they've given in to a future developmental pathway that is anchored on a false promise of development. So what needs to change? I think we need to have more kind of bottom-up approaches, technical engagements at community levels. I think we need to, those who go to COPs is fine. But if we're a community, we know our problems. We try and address them at a communal level with less expectation that the government will. What we do with the government is that we try to tell them what we want and what we're going to do in our community for our benefit. And the more we have these community approaches, so if we have an El Nino season in Southern Africa at the moment, we are going to face hunger and the death of livestock, and it will be worse by the time we get to June next year. If we are communities and we wait for the loss and damage fund, we wait for the government to do something, these two things will not happen, but we are going to lose our livestock. The 2-3 that we have, we are going to have hunger in our communities. So we need to organize and begin to have these local coalitions that push governments at least to have policies that speak to particular community needs. And the communication, I think the media has failed doing that. That's the mainstream media. for me, the hope now is in two ways. We need people that will try and do research. And I haven't started engaging seriously around this, but I think that is where the research has to go. What are the alternative ways of talking about climate crisis outside of the mainstream media? And how feasible is it for us to reconfigure interpersonal group and community forms of dialogue and begin to see these as the only hope, but having dialogue that is so much alive in terms of allowing debate and contestation and the ability to see differently, but at the end of the day, be able to say, we agree these are our community problems and we've discussed this, but this is where we should be going. And begin to have communities push governments to change the way they do things. I'll give an example. We have a community in the northern part of Zimbabwe, maybe northwestern, that share their community with a game park. So obviously we have wildlife conflicts, but that has been in existence. But the government has given licenses to coal mines. We've seen wild animals dying, and we've seen local people's cattle dying. And I think we've lost 3 people over a year. That is something that can trigger more dialogue, but we don't have to wait for a crisis of that nature to lose people. But we need to rethink. The media is very good in terms of telling us what governments are talking about and what they say they will do. But I don't think the media has been able to come down to us. Up until maybe we have very functional community media systems that are led by people from the community and that allow community members to engage in discussions. So in terms of the media, we might have a chance through community media, but the very idea of community media is that it has to be founded by the community, have community people as volunteers, etc. That's not the model in Africa. Governments think that by having radio stations in each constituency, it becomes community. For me, that remains a state platform, but that is closer to us. But it's not community in terms of its aspiration. So I think we are very far, and then the work that needs to happen is a lot. But you are doing that already. I mean, so it's this important. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think I was almost rounding off.
I mean, I think this points to what I think is a really critical and hopeful area of work, which is particularly as climate impacts are getting worse, and in most impacted areas, whether in Southern Africa, it's drought is obvious, and desertification are huge ones. In a lot of island nations, it's extreme weather, it's flooding, and whether it's flooding in Pakistan, fires, and we've seen all over the world. As these impacts are getting more extreme, the need for communities to organize for mutual aid, for building resilient networks on the models that you're talking about becomes just a necessity of survival, right? And I think that part of the collapse that I see already taking place is as these disasters become more extreme, governments being less and less able to fix them. And this country, of course, we've seen that that disaster capitalism is always that there's private equities buying up all the disaster relief companies to extract profit while they continue to invest in fossil fuels and then hiring undocumented workers and hyper exploiting them and leaving. So we see that the system that's causing these problems is unwilling and unable to actually go in and really address people. So people need to build these resilient networks. They need to help each other. They need to make sure that those in the face of disaster, whether it's immediate like a storm or ongoing like droughts and food production. But then there's the political side, which is you can't mutual aid your way out of a collapsing global society, right? It's not enough. And what I think, and I think this points to what you're saying also in terms of community media, is and I've been learning talking to people around this area is just how do we that those forms of mutual aid and resilient network building isn't different than the political organization. It's actually the supreme means of politically organizing people. When people start coming together to try and create a resilient microgrid of renewable energy that can keep everyone power all the time, and certainly in the case of storms, when people start looking at how to produce food, whether it's in an urban neighborhood or jointly together, whatever it is that people are doing to try and take these things, also then can organize people to start pushing demands from government and corporate structures, right? Because you're actually organized. And I think that to me is and it won't look the same. It's going to be different depending on the communities.
Yeah.
It's going to be very different. But to me, that's the nexus of power that we're going to need, which is people learning and using and learning from each other horizontally, right? Not from an NGO that takes a baked-in development model, shows up and tries to impose it onto a rural community, but actually horizontal communication between communities. But then being able to come together and organize and actually push government and community structures. And then I think that community media is critical in terms of especially that horizontal communication, right? That we're not just getting messages from the center, right, from the top. That actually that people can start to communicate and learn models from each other that work. So I think that community media and that those local voices is really critical. It is something that we are really aspiring to do essentially as part of our project, is to amplify those kinds of voices. So I think that's, to me, that sense of community media, of local voices and resilient networks and local political organization to push changes in the system all really end up being the same thing, right? They're all really a single effort with 1,000, 10,000 different flavors depending on where they exist. Resilient network building of mutual aid in the face of disasters and ongoing degradation of social systems, but also how can community media and community voices work to amplify that and share those lessons horizontally. I think that's some of the biggest tasks we face, right? There are big technology things to solve, but honestly, most of them are just about time and resources. I think it's these social questions that are the biggest challenge that we're facing going into this climate. I mean, the climate's the sharp end of the stick, but it's all of it. It's biodiversity, it's freshwater, soil, climate. It's all of the disasters that, colonization really has, the fruit of colonization, right? All the different fruits, and then there's so many of them. But that in the face of that, it's going to be these social questions that I think are really going to be central. Do you think that there are models of community media like that are starting to work that you see?
Not necessarily. Maybe what I've observed, and this is concerning, is that I think post-colonial governments have adopted this idea of the media as a developmental tool. So the normative theory that was adopted was that the media was supposed to help us in the development agenda. But what they then did not deliberately mention was that the agenda was the development of the political interests of the new political elites. And what I've noticed, I think, if you listen to a number of the so-called community broadcasters that are essentially state-run, is that the idea is the existential need of the ones that are funding. So even the very idea of what it is their role, because I always believe that there is a possibility of separating the politics from the other issues. But I think we are forever tied into politics, and we are forever thinking of leadership and elections, and we focus less on um, things that affect people. Of course, all our problems are political. That's where they start from. They are manufactured by political and corporate interests that have nothing to do with us. But there is a possibility of organizing at community level, pursue our interests to dislodge the politics and the economics that are not working for us. So obviously we need to pay so much attention to what's happening politically and in the economic arena, but with the idea that whatever is not working for us should not be part of us. So there is that need for radicalism, but I would say that is also very much informed by long-term objectives. Not that I think now I'm sort of toning down, but I think that if we want to win long-term wars, we start planning now. And when we plan now, we don't plan it as a war, but we plan it as a way to live better. So that whoever we are telling that we need to do this or we are communicating with, we are not making it about power per se, but we're presenting it as a way to live better. So in a way that when we talk about that, we need to safeguard our water sources, for example. What does that mean for me as a community member, as someone who has their goats and their cattle drinking from that water source, and where I also get water for my small garden? But when we plan it, we must have long-term objectives, but that are anchored on the need to build better lives. So we do that. People see the fruits of that, and they engage, and they become part of us. And we do it in a way that does not attract immediate confrontation. Once you attract immediate confrontation from either the corporate sector or the political sector, you become sort of fixed in a war that you're not prepared for and that you're likely not going to win. But doesn't mean that you shouldn't fight it. But I'm saying there's need to re-strategize and approach these things in a very calculated way. I think I've listened to a judge from Rwanda. Obviously, I know it's not a very good example of, but I was in that room and I thought what he was saying was our governments are difficult to deal with. So what you need to do is to bring the benefit and begin to push and have conversations from the outside into the inner circle, but build those important networks. So I think I was trying to say to civil society, if you come and confront, you'll be arrested, of which it's unfair and it's not justice. But how do you circumvent the idea of activists dying or being arrested? I think that you need a mixture of that soft conversations and also some form of radicalism, especially where, for example, a government says we're going to have a special economic zone, and by that they mean a game park, and they want to bring in their investors to come and dig in the park. Obviously, you need to confront that so that it stops, it doesn't take off. But also need to make sure that the leadership doesn't get arrested and then government still continues. So I think there's need to navigate the terrains in a way that is well structured and well thought of, that if this happens, then we have this plan B. But this should never happen.
But I like that. I mean, that framing of live better. It's a powerful way to bring in people who don't want to be activists, right, and engage them in process. And that's again where I think that idea of building mutual aid and resilient networks and solving problems locally that inherently organizes people politically, even if they are not saying I'm a political organizer.
Yeah.
But then their expectations and their communications and their solidarity has been built up. And like you said, I mean, the ideal is you don't want to confront, especially if it's a repressive government or corporations that are willing to bring in armed force, because that just, you often lose and people get hurt. If you can get power that's outside of that and you can avoid that, all the better. We know that will happen sometimes, because especially when this sharp thing comes. But even what you're saying is, if people are organized around living better, I mean, it's really why unions work, right? Unions come in and say, hey, let's raise your wages. They're not saying, hey, let's overthrow capitalism. Let's start with, they're saying, let's raise your wages. But getting people into those organizations then gives people a power socially that they don't have isolated.
Yeah.
Of course, there's all sorts of problems, because then those organizations become part, so it's never simple, never will be simple. None of this is simple. But I do like that idea of really thinking of like those resilient networks of just as a way to organize people to live better. So it's a really powerful framing that actually does translate, because what does that mean means different things in different places, right? So it does actually, that framing can translate to all sorts of circumstances.
Yeah.
Developed countries, urban, rural. It's like, how do we take what we have and how do we live better? It's an interesting framing. I hope that we talked about this before we got in this conversation today, about working together to see if we could help in any way. You, and I know you've got students in classes doing climate journalism, to help you all produce some of these stories and distribute, because I do think that horizontal conversation is really critical. And these kinds of stories, I hope that's something that we're able to do. I would be extremely excited about being able to facilitate, offer whatever resources we have. We don't have many now, but hopefully we'll have more. But we do make a lot of video. We have a lot of people who make a lot of video. So depending on the skills that we might be able to, or other resources, and start to build up our network of broadcasting that doesn't require, the New York Post and the Guardian, on average, is about the best right now for climate coverage. But you're certainly going to find some of those things that you found wrong with the NGOs in terms of neoliberal framing is even going to show up in a place like the Guardian. And that's the Guardian is about as good as it gets right now in mainstream climate reporting. They consistently do it. They do bring in questions of social justice, but even there, it is not voices from below. So I hope that's something that we can do. That's something I'm really excited about doing, is seeing if we can help you, your students, and other voices, because it's this horizontal communication, this community media isn't going to just come from, it's not going to come from the UN, right? Yeah. It's certainly not going to come from the World Bank. It's probably not going to come from most NGOs. It's got to actually come from up, and it's going to best be fed by this kind of horizontal networks. These conversations that lead to then mutual, aid in terms of media making and distribution. So I hope that's something that we can really jump into. I'm ready, and anytime you're ready to start figuring that out, because I think it's really important. Just what I've learned from you today is just that kind of slice of what, in general, people in the movement need to be learning, hearing voices they're not hearing, and this kind of horizontal communication between local communities.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just for us, I mean, we are lucky that we now have a campus radio, which sort of is gaining a lot of audience. And we had at some point a slot, students were calling it Green Conversations. And we had a discussion around whether when they came up with the word green, were they thinking of the ideological connotations, or they were drawn by the niceness of the word. And so I know they told me the other day that no, we're now trying to come up with a word that we think is different from green, so that we don't seem to be greenwashing a lot of things, which I like. So obviously we will really appreciate assistance in terms of producing short stories, especially from communities. Either we make them, some of them podcasts, but I think these short stories that are told from different communities and that sort of reflect and talk about the problems in different communities, how obviously communities are very different. All our students, they come from the four regions of the country. There's something that is interesting but strange. The climate in the country is different. There's a region that is continually hot and dry. There's a region where it rains every day throughout. So having these experiences from students that come from all these divisions, but maybe making them others documentaries, and we can obviously work with. There is a broadcasting stream. I know they do have drama. They also have documentaries, and I've been discussing with the editor-in-chief of the national TV for the possibility of a documentary. He's my former student, and he was interested. And I'm meeting them tomorrow, but not concerning this, but some training on data journalism. And I'd already written in my notebook that we need to revive the discussion around the documentary on environment and climate change and figure it out. I think what would be key is to have a concept note from our side and aspirations. I haven't talked to students because I think it has to be sort of something that is led from that particular constituency. Um, and then 2 pages maybe that we can send to you. And then I know mostly the help has to be about how we have done it in terms of sharing experiences, how we can do it better, how to record it better, edit better. And I think the other details we can share, but we need, most importantly, the encouragement that it can be done, because we're a community radio and we have a community to serve. The good thing with us that we are from a national university that has students across the country. Over 2,000 learn through remote learning, so they're in all over the region, all over the regions. So the more we reach them, we can easily reach anyone and have this content. And so we're still trying to target our students that live in that part of the world. So without that geographical limitation. But would really appreciate that. I'll talk to the HOT about it tomorrow when we are going for that meeting at the TV station. Because I think we're also trying to see how better we utilize the community radio. The license grant, I was saying, we have been having this license, but we don't think we're making as much impact as we expect you to be having. So we really appreciate the help and you coming in to help us in this particular aspect. And
I'm very, very excited. Let us know. I'd love to read what you've got. And if just however we can be helpful. Sometimes just having to show a piece to someone outside makes sometimes just that, it almost doesn't matter. The audience is just a convenient thing that you're working against. So I'm happy to do that. And I teach media at different points also. So just having another voice as a crit session, but if there's practical things, helping understand how to do, I don't know where people's skills are, but like graphics or shooting, the technical things, the storytelling, and eventually, hopefully, helping find some of those stories that might make sense to a global audience. and try and give it a platform and amplify it as much as we can. Anything we can do, because I think that this, I really do think that this, this kind of storytelling is essential to the future. It's just so essential. I think it's some of the most important. If we can play a small role in helping support it, I think it'll be some of the most important things we can do. I just think it's some of the most important storytelling that can happen right now. Please.
No, not essential, but just to say thank you so much for reaching out initially, and I'm happy we finally managed to record.
Yes.
I remember Sam's email. I think it was the conference in Lyon, and I saw it late. I said, "No, I'm still available. I'm still up to the idea." But once I go back home, and I think last week you were held up, and we have managed today to do it. And thank you so much for the good work. And I really look forward to partnerships for living well, for having lives that are better thing for the future. And I'll keep in touch in terms of in terms of once I have the conversations tomorrow, because at least tomorrow I have access to most of these people. And the radio station I was there today, the national radio. What shocked me, I always think that because they're government run, so they obviously are antagonistic. You get there, they say, we need you to help us redo journalism in more objective ways. We need to know what else we should be focusing on, and we need to help them. I was shocked today. We got that kind of reception.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I think even at that level, we might have some of the short stories, then filtering into the national radio, and that would be excellent.
That's excellent. That's really exciting. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Harold, and also thanks to Sam.